Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this session. Workplace culture is increasingly talked about as an important driver of organizational success. Yet many of us struggle, frankly, to find ways to link our culture to performance in a useful way. And culture is more than conceptual. It actually can be measured and it can be improved upon in ways that will spike an organization's performance, but many of us are frankly unsure how to go about this or even where to start. So we decided to commission a study to dig into some of this work. And we commissioned a study with Question Pro, who you'll hear from today, to help us think through what some of the more specific factors are that drive tangible and meaningful and lasting results in some of the most successful U.S. charitable organizations. In essence, we took a look at some of the organizations that we accredit, some of the groups that have our seal and have gone through our process, and we looked at their cultures in comparison to a benchmark of organizations that weren't accredited to try to see what those differences were and how organizations that were accredited stood out from a cultural standpoint. And so you're going to hear about the results of that survey today, but you're also going to find out some of the more interesting things you can do to measure and analyze your own culture. And you're also going to hear a case study directly from one of the organizations that went through this process so that in the end, you can hear from their direct experience. So I want to introduce our panelists today. Charlie Judy is going to share the results of the study. Charlie was the person we contracted with to get this study done. And he is an executive with the organization WorkXO and Question Pro. Tom Bagnano is the CEO of Community Health Charities. And Tom is the CEO of the organization that actually went through the process. And of course, you know who I am. So BBB Wise Giving Alliance, just a quick update for those of you who don't know who we are. We accredit charities by evaluating them in relation to a set of 20 standards. These standards cover governance, oversight, financial effectiveness, mission effectiveness, fundraising collateral, and a host of other things to help organizations demonstrate trustworthiness to their donors and their stakeholders. Question Pro, you'll hear more about, is an organization that is in the business of designing and creating studies that help organizations clarify their mission, vision, and values, and to differentiate their work in relation to other organizations as well. So why this collaboration? The collaboration was important, again, because we think that trustworthy organizations are organizations that can be distinguished in a variety of ways from other organizations. And we wanted to be able to demonstrate that, at least from the standpoint of how they manage their workforce and their internal cultures. And what this will mean for you is that this collaboration should have research findings, and it also produced, we believe, some compelling evidence that certain workplace behaviors drive mission readiness in charitable organizations. And you're going to see that, I believe, through the presentation today. And we'll hopefully get to answer some of your questions later on, too. So, Charlie, I want to turn it over to you now to share some of the results of this study.
So thanks for teeing it up, Art. There is some really interesting work being done these days around how certain behaviors in the workplace influence certain outcomes in the workplace, and certainly as we're thinking about this particular audience, the giving audience, even more broadly the not-for-profit sector, at the root of desired workplace outcomes is mission. If your workforce is aligned with that mission, if it is behind that mission, passionate about, focused on, and really engaged in moving it forward. We know that organizations have stronger, better, longer lasting success when they've got that kind of alignment with their workforce. And we'll refer to that throughout as kind of mission readiness. These are organizations that have proven themselves to be effective in achieving their mission and putting the right workforce behind it in order to make that happen. We wanted to draw out some of the things that really characterize those mission-ready organizations. What can we learn about what those organizations are maybe doing differently than other organizations? And so that really is kind of at the core of our study. We selected 8 organizations that already hold the Wise Giving Alliance seal and are accredited as effective giving organizations. They've already gone through kind of a rigorous evaluation process for having been effective and successful in achieving their mission. And this became our study group. We had 217 individual responses from from across the 8 organizations that we conducted our evaluation with, and using the assessment, which I'll talk about in just a moment. That first of all, it's important to say that response is in fact statistical significance. We made sure that we had the right number of people responding to the survey so that we could draw meaningful and valid and reliable conclusions from it. We also have a benchmark from our database of organizations that we've worked with across the globe, with close to 1,800 individual responses, again broadly from not-for-profits, and neither one of those not-for-profits, there were 27 of them that we chose in our benchmark, had the Wise Giving Alliance accreditation or seal. So they have not gone through the same rigorous approval process and kind of vetting for that effectiveness, that readiness. We used our WorkXO culture assessment. WorkXO is a product of QuestionPro. It is our primary tool for measuring, analyzing, and then hopefully acting on workplace culture. That's a model that we've established over time. We've gathered close to a million data points on it. And again, we use that as the foundation for what we tried to learn from this exercise. And after getting the data and consolidating it, we really got into the analytics. We tore it apart, and we started to isolate some things that really stood out as being unique to these organizations. We're going to share those with you in just a second. Just a few more words about the study itself, just to set it up. So it starts with a 15-minute digital survey. Again, we asked every employee from every organization that participated in the study to take the survey. We administered it, and so they knew that their responses were going to be confidential, and that they themselves would remain anonymous. We did not disclose the individual responses, and we reported really only in the aggregate. As a result, again, we gathered these 217 individual responses to the data and started to kind of come up with some findings. The model itself, we won't spend a lot of time talking about this, but it's kind of important to understand the context. The model is really about understanding how you work, what behaviors show up and what behaviors do not, for that matter, and the extent to which they show up. And those behaviors are kind of categorized under 8 headings. We call them culture markers, but each of these is really designed to tell a different part of the story about what employees experience when they show up every day. So agility is all about how we make decisions and how we distribute control and how we manage change. Collaboration obviously is how we team, but it's also about how do we share information across borders and boundaries. How compartmentalized are we? How fluid are we in dealing with teams across the organization? Growth is how we invest in the individual and how we invest in the community. Inclusion is really the sense of belonging that we create. That involves authenticity. It also involves diversity, and sense of ownership that really we're creating for the success of the organization. I won't go on I won't go through these in a lot of detail, but behind each of these, there are distinct behaviors that we're asking people to identify with. And basically what we ask them is, how much do you experience this? along a continuum of not at all to all the time. Based on their responses, then we started to draw our conclusions. 64 behaviors in this survey, and then one interesting outcome. It's the dependent variable, and we won't get all statistical, but the dependent variable of determining what's the result of all of these behaviors that people experience or don't experience. How is that impacting sentiment, connection to, affiliation with, engagement with the organization at large? And we use a measure called ENPS, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So once we gathered this information, we tore it apart. We threw it into our set of analytical tools, which are designed to give us a kind of a number of outputs, allow us to compare a number of data points, to slice it and dice it really anyway till Sunday, to start drawing out some of those things which really we believe are important to the success of this particular archetype or study that we conducted. The study included a slice of really any number of demographics, including departmental and level. We looked at gender, we looked at ethnicity and race, we looked at generation and how each of those segments experienced culture maybe a little bit differently. We're not going to share information at that level in this presentation, but know that we got into that. We also looked at all the individual comments that we received as additional context and color to understand thematically kind of what that experience really looked like. As a result, this is what we came up with. If we could do a drum roll here, we would. But the three things we're going to show you. The first is which behaviors, which organizational behaviors show up the most, are really most prominent and experienced most consistently across these mission-ready organizations. We're going to talk a little bit about which behaviors are a lot more prominent or show up a lot more than those in the benchmark. So how do those two populations differ? Mission-ready to non-mission ready. What kinds of behaviors are really most different when comparing those two groups? And then the third is which behaviors appear to have the strongest impact or correlation to things like employee net promoter score, which again we'll talk about in just a second. And hopefully the things that we share will fuel some thinking on your own end, maybe start to put some dialogue together in your own organization around whether or not these kinds of behaviors are surfacing themselves. We'll talk about some other things that you can do with that as well. Here's the overall findings from this exercise. At a very high level, we know as a result of doing this study that mission-ready organizations are generally more agile, they are more collaborative, they're more inclusive, they're more innovative, and they're more transparent. In general, based on the data that we gathered between these two populations, that's kind of what stands out at a top line. We also know that there's a higher prominence. The behaviors that we believe to be desirable in driving mission show up a lot more than they do in some of these other organizations. Overall, this mission-ready group had an employee net promoter score that was 147% higher than our benchmark. That's really remarkable, and a sign of, again, the degree of engagement, connectivity, intent to stay, overall connection with the mission and the organization at large. And as a result of all these things, we believe these organizations just have a stronger connection to brand and mission as a result of the behaviors they've been able to propagate in their cultures. So let's talk about those behaviors a little bit. First of all, some of the things that show up really most in these organizations. These are the behaviors that if you were to kind of talk about in these organizations, people would nod their head and they'd go, yep, that's us. This is us. This helps me understand kind of what it's like to work here. And They are. The first one is really, again, around kind of collaboration. Hey, if I need some help, people will help me. We'll run to the side of the ship that needs the most attention. We divide and conquer. We're really good at sharing workload along the way. The second, which I think all would hope to see, is that there's a strong belief that their work contributes value to something or someone who matters. I mean, that really in and of itself is about the mission. And the fact that that is something that is so strong in these organizations is again validating about, or validation about this mission readiness. The third is around inspiration, that they generally, employees gain a sense of inspiration. They are inspired by others around them. That they get energy from, that they are motivated by, and they learn from people that are part of their team and along this journey on that mission with them. Incidentally, and that's what the little asterisk means, is that is a behavior that does not show up as prominently, or is not one of the top 5 behaviors in the benchmark. It's not something that presents as strongly in the benchmark. The fourth, again, is something that we'd hope to see with these organizations, that we care about making our community a better place to live. Again, strong connection with the mission there. And again, that one does not show up as a top 5 in our benchmark, in those organizations that are not as mission ready. Finally, this last one's around inclusion, the sense that we get to work with people with different backgrounds, different perspectives, experiences, opinions, etc. That diversity is more pervasive in these organizations than maybe we see in others. By the way, as we're going through this, I encourage you all to kind of, if you have questions, feel free to submit them in the chat, and we have some time reserved at the end that we'll get back to, and happy to add more clarification if we have time at the end here, so feel free to do that. So here's a little bit of a different spin. These are the behaviors in our mission-ready organizations that show up far more than they do in our non-mission-ready organizations, so the benchmark. I think there's some interesting stuff going on here. So if of the 64 behaviors that we measured, these had a bigger gap in how much they showed up in our benchmark compared to how much they showed up in our mission ready group. Okay, so the first is that there's a lot of clarity around what drives success in our organization. There's people are kind of resolute about what we're here to do and what's going to make us successful. There isn't a lot of question around that. There's a lot more acceptance, acknowledgement, and understanding of what that mission is all about. These organizations are a lot better at removing silos and boundaries. They aren't as territorial. There is much more fluidity in how these teams work together than we see in some of these other organizations. This third one is a lot of the same. People know what people need from them at the right place and the right time. This is about information flow. This is also about collaboration. This is in how we work together as a collective as opposed to individual units within that collective. This fourth is really interesting, and it's not one that we see show up in enterprise very often. It's about agility, and it's how good we are at fixing things or changing things if something's not working. And these mission-ready organizations are really good at doing that, much more than the other organizations that we've studied. They're just good at fixing stuff when it needs fixing for whatever reason. And then this last one's about innovation. We're okay with saying, you know what, there's probably a new way to do this, and we're willing to check that out. We move past that objection of, you know what, we've always done it that way, it's easier to do it that way, let's just do it that way, right? And we see this again more in mission-ready organizations than we do in others, a lot more. So this is a little bit of an eye chart, and we're going to get to some, some interesting stories from Tom here in just a second around kind of how all this plays out. But I've been referring to ENPS. It stands for Employee Net Promoter Score. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this measure. Some of you may be more familiar with NPS, which is the Net Promoter Score. was really designed to help us measure customer experience and customer satisfaction, more of a market-facing measure. We bring it internally, and we measure it based on employees' answer to one question. How likely are you to recommend somebody that you respect this organization for employment? One question, one answer on a scale of 0 to 10. Those people that answer with a 9 or a 10, they're your promoters. They're the ones that are out there waving the flag. They are visible and vocal in promoting your brand and encouraging other people to work there. Those that answer with a 6 or below are what we call detractors. And they're on the opposite end of the spectrum. They could potentially be damaging your brand. But you take a look at the difference between the amount of promoters you have and the number of detractors that you have, and that's your employee net promoter score. It's a great one measure to monitor over time. It's a great measure to keep an eye on as you trend, as your organization flows, as new people are hired and others leave. It's a really good kind of indicator of overall connection with and affiliation with the organization at large. And we use that in our calculations as we start to figure out kind of priorities for businesses when we do this study. It can be a great proxy for stuff like employee engagement and productivity and turnover, lower cost to hire, effective giving, we believe, and I think that pans out here. The long and the short of it is we know that as those behaviors that we measure show up more and more, as they become more prominent in these organizations, employee net promoter score also goes up. The more it's likely that your employees are out there waving the flag when these behaviors that we measured. And as we said before, in our study, their ENPS is 147% higher. The likelihood that someone answers that question with a 9 or a 10 is 147% higher. Again, that's remarkable. There's something about that connection with the mission and purpose of the organization. So when we considered all of that, we did our analysis behind the scenes, and we have an algorithm that helps us come up with this, and we won't really talk about what that algorithm is, but we used it, again, we've used it with organizations across the globe. These behaviors seem to have a really big impact on employee net promoter scores in these mission-ready organizations. These are the kinds of things that matter most to the employees that are in these mission-ready organizations. If you have more of these behaviors in mission-ready organizations, you're likely to have a higher employee net promoter score. They are stuff like, you know what? We're open to feedback from anyone and everyone, even if they disagree with us. We're okay with that. In fact, we welcome it. The second is around, we hold ourselves accountable. We put our money where our mouth is. We actually evaluate the quality of the decisions that we make internally. We're okay with saying we messed up. We're okay with saying we probably need to do it different next time. This third one goes back to one of the things that we saw earlier. People really understand their strategy. And they don't only understand it, but they actually use it as a guide. They use it as kind of the cheat sheet. They use it as the toolkit for how are we going to make a decision. Does that decision enforce, reinforce, or clarify what our mission is really all about? These organizations do that better. And it has a big impact, again, on employee net promoter score. The higher that is, the more engaged your people are. My company is generally interested in my health and welfare. It's one thing to say that you're interested. It's another to actually show it. How does that show up in your organization? How do you experience that? How do you feel it? This is one of those things that has a big impact in these organizations. And finally, again, tied to innovation a little bit, this whole idea of being comfortable with taking some risks, trying a new way of doing things. It's okay if we make mistakes. That's part of the process. It's part of how we grow. It's part of how we evolve. That kind of behavior drives employee promotion in these mission-ready organizations. Now, could you take this and say, we're going to apply this in our own organization and we're going to have a higher employee net promoter score and we're going to be mission ready. Not necessarily. It's not that easy, and every organization is really dynamic, and you need to be introspective and understand what's going on with your business. But this is a great place to start the conversation. It's a great set of things to be considering, and we'd love for you to start having that conversation on your own. But to kind of bring this to life a little bit, to give you a little bit of a perspective on kind of how this really comes into action. Tom's with us. Tom experienced this firsthand. His organization, Community Health Charities, experienced this firsthand as they were one of the participants in the study. And we've asked him to join us just to tell us a little bit more about that experience and generally how this has played out in their own attention to culture in their workplace. So Tom, I'm going to just hand it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you also, Art. I'll share with you, it was a real pleasure to be a participant in the study. I'm not sure we started at that with that statement, but let me walk you through a little bit of our experience, why it turned out to be one of the most productive, one of the most beneficial things I think we've done with our workforce in recent history. But in context, let me just set it. I mean, part of the message today is that if the right culture really drives mission success, then it is imperative for my organization, all of those listening, to make sure that they've got the right culture. And that really comes down to, do we have the right workforce to be able to contend with all the complexities that we face in the world today with innovation and technology and changes in our population. Community Health Charities, we're actually over a 60-year-old organization, and the best way to describe us, and I think it made us a perfect participant for this study, our network, what we do is we have a network of nonprofit partners, over 2,000 of them, that represent some of the most well-known, respected, most credible names in health and wellness in the United States, and you're familiar with most of them. We also have a network, however, of over 2,000 businesses, corporations, mostly Fortune 500 companies, and then other companies around the country, regional companies. So in one sense, we're dealing with our nonprofit community, and in the other sense, we're trying to integrate them, particularly their health and wellness programs and benefits and contacts with over 17 million people in the workforce every day. So we're kind of in a unique intersection here. But most importantly to me, when it really came down to why we ended up being a participant and why we felt that it was so beneficial, is that it really forced us to look at our own workforce and to measure, are we really ready to encounter some of the things coming down the pike in terms of innovation and change? If we're dealing with nonprofits who are changing on a daily basis, if we're dealing with a workforce in this country that is going again through incredible innovation changes and technology changes and generational changes, are we as an organization that connects both of them ourselves ready, and our workforce ready to be able to produce the outcomes that we want and our board of directors want for the future? So with that kind of a context, when we first looked at the study, when Art introduced it to our organization, the first thing I'll share with you is it forced us to really take a hard look at what culture actually is. And here's what we discovered in our own organization. All too often, we talk about culture an awful lot. We'll talk about it in our meetings, our board meetings with our nonprofit and corporate partners. But many times what we were really talking about was strong morale. And there's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes these studies, and we've employed them in the past, they tend to measure a lot about employee satisfaction, which is important, and communication between supervisor and employee, and that's important too. But what we discovered, that really wasn't necessarily culture. Those factors contribute to strong morale, but what it did is it forced us to look at the distinction between culture and morale. What we discovered in taking this survey and then being blown away candidly by the outcomes is that it defined for us, culture is really our operating system, if you want to just say it that way. It's characterized by the things that we do and repeat on a regular basis, on an everyday basis, how we go about making decisions. And do those decisions really reflect the priorities that we emphasize, the philosophies, the values that we espouse and feel are most important to us, our nonprofit partners, their patient populations, and the employees that we work with? What we discovered is that many times some of the surveys we've taken in the past will measure employee satisfaction and some of the issues around morale, but they're not measuring the things that we really need to measure in terms of our performance. Are we really ready to tackle the mission that's before us? Let me give you some, I hope, specific examples. I'll just do this very quickly. What we got out of the study, and it's very scientific, there was loads of data that we're still actually even going through, but here's what it showed us. Charlie talked to you before about some of those core cultural components, things like agility and collaboration and growth and inclusion and all the others. I'm not sure we've ever really looked at those before. We've talked about them, but we've never been able to figure out a way to actually measure them. One of the outcomes of this study is that the questions that were asked allowed all of our workers, including myself, top to bottom, to be able to answer questions that would give us some indication about how we were reacting to things like agility, collaboration, working together, our readiness for growth. Are we really truly inclusive by the very definition of that word? So for us, one of the pleasant things that came out of this is, and Charlie can obviously give you more information, but it broke down. If you take a look at a workforce, it would say there's a certain segment that would say traditionalist. And that's not bad, because if you're in a business that's doing things on an everyday basis and it's a robust business, growing and thriving in that field, you need people that can be traditionalists. But it also measures that element of your workforce that would be defined as contemporary, and most importantly for us, futurist. Because again, we're in the business of health and well-being in this country, changing. You have to be looking to the future. You have to be looking to how we're going to move the needle at a community level of really building stronger, healthier, safer communities. So what it did for us, for the first time in our history, it gave us a solid benchmark that told us, fortunately, almost all of our scores in those 8 or 9 areas, we were right on the cusp of contemporary and leaning into futurist. So in other words, at the high end of contemporary and at the very lowest area of futurist. Well, that was really welcome news. It was welcome news to our board of directors. I've said before, we're almost 65 years old, but 2 years ago, we went through a major work with our board to actually update and completely change our mission. Therefore, we had to have a workforce that was looking more to the future and then to the past. So that's one thing that it gave us, a solid, definable, measurable benchmark about where our workforce is. The implication of that, when we take that survey again next year, we'll be able to see, are we still at that cusp line? Have we moved over into more attracting the right kind of employees who, again, are open to innovation, who understand inclusion, who really are looking for solutions, who are looking to make things better in the workforce and for all of our constituencies. The other major thing I'll share with you was that it gave us, again, some very tangible, hardcore recommendations. It basically told us, at a simplified level, here are the behaviors that community health charities should preserve. These are I think Charlie, the term you guys use are evolutionary accelerants. What he told us was, the study told us was, these are the behaviors in our workforce that are really allowing us to move things forward, to look to the future, to be, again, nimble, agile enough to deal with all the change every day. These are the kind of behaviors you should preserve, enhance, nurture, work on. But just as importantly, it also told us, what are the inhibitors? What are those behaviors that, if you surveyed our entire workforce, and they did, those are the kind of behaviors that may have inhibited us from being more successful, more productive, more forward-leaning in the past. So it gave us, if you will, a template to look at, to say, this is what we're doing right, we need to do more of this. And it wasn't an indictment. which is, again, different than in this survey. There was no apprehension from senior staff all the way through our workforce, because it didn't tell anybody, you know, you're doing this wrong, or this is a bad behavior. It was more as expressed as, these are the things that might be holding you back. So you need to maybe focus on these, about getting maybe senior staff to be more open to allow all the staff to do the kind of work that they should do, or how we can collaborate more effectively, more communicate cross-culturally or across different departments. So those were the things that I felt, Charlie and Art, that were most valuable to us. And honestly, in our experience, first time that we have something very tangible that we can hold on to, look to how we're going to perform in the future. And the message I gave our board of directors was that these were the behaviors, these were the aspects that would tell you, we have the right workforce, we are prepared, we are ready to encounter the challenges that are going to come in the future.
Awesome, Tom. Thanks for that. And it's the first time I've heard you articulate it to that extent. It's always rewarding to hear how any organization takes data and turns it into action. One of the things I loved about, or a couple of things I loved about what you had to share. Every organization will react to and process and then you know, plan around and then act on this data a little differently. For you all, it was really important to wear the lens of, are we evolving towards the future of work? For others, it may be about, are we entering into this merger and acquisition with the right point of view? Are we growing at the right pace? Do we have the right product line? I mean, there's lots of things that culture can be at the root of. You all took it for what it needed to be taken for, and you're using that directly to solve for it. The other thing I want to point out, which I love hearing it from you, because it's really core to what we believe about culture. Culture is not about good or bad. It's not about a score. It's not about a grade. It's about what works for you. And only you can make that decision. What an assessment can do is give you the data to have a better conversation around it, a more informed conversation. Now you're not just operating from assumptions. You actually have got something in front of you. That data is empirical. It's something that you can all talk about, but you still need to talk about it. You still need to apply it to how it works in your world. And I love that you're doing that. I love that you think about it as an operating system. At the end of the day, that's what this is all about. How do we make it central to what we do every day? And you all have obviously already taken the steps on that. So thanks for sharing that. Art, I'm going to hand it kind of back over to you here, and certainly feel free to opine as well on what time.
I think Tom's presentation and yours too, Charlie, were both very enlightening. And you know, one thing I wanted to just make a point of is just saying how courageous it is for an organization to actually take this step. I think it's clear to me that many who lead organizations kind of know or think they know what their organizational cultures are. And if they're not the way they want them to be, or at least they think they're not where they want them to be, they kind of don't want to really know that, because it means they have to do something about it and they don't quite know what to do. But here are some things that you can actually do. You can actually do things to address what you might see as cultures that need certain types of changing or adjustment. There are actions that you can actually take. And so, you know, I just wanted to just thank Tom for just being willing to take the survey to begin with. And I think you're part of a new breed, Tom, of chief executives, even though you've been around a while. You're a new breed of chief executives that understand that their most important asset is their organization and their employees. And what really makes that asset thrive is how they work together in a culture that is clearly defined and understood by the people working there. So we wanted to just talk a little bit about how this whole process worked. And what we asked CEOs to do is to simply identify the behaviors that are critical to their success, critical to their mission success. What do you need to see? And these are sort of, force-fed among a list of about 60 or so items. And we asked them, what are the items that you really must see in your organization? And then we asked the employees to take the survey, and so that we could kind of see what the current situation is, at least how employees define the current situation. And then we analyzed to see if what the employees have identified as seeing what shows up in the organization is actually in alignment with what those critical behaviors were that the chief executives and the leadership of the organization thought must be in place in order for them to achieve their mission. And then you can begin to isolate some of the priorities that will actually show how to address some of the misalignment that could be there. Hopefully you don't have a lot of misalignment, but where you do, you now know as an executive how to address them. And I think for anyone leading an organization, that is truly valuable information.
So Art, as part of this collaboration that we set off on purely as a study to learn some things, we started to have a conversation around, maybe this is something that other organizations would actually benefit from kind of going through this exercise. Is there a way for us to make this more accessible to the community? And what we've come up with, and we won't talk a lot about this because we expect to launch some more information in the near future here around really what this looks like, and how those of you that may be interested in taking a somewhat of the same journey that Tom and his organization have taken, as well as others in this study, we'll get some more information out about that. But we've developed what we call a mission readiness report, and it effectively takes the process that Art just described. Let's understand what must be. Let's understand what is. Let's find the differences between those two things, and then let's start to prioritize around it. We know we cannot be all things to all people. We know that we will never be masters of everything that we could be doing in the workplace. But if we can find the one or two or three things that are really going to have the biggest impact, what a great way to usher our resources and dedicate our time. And so that's what this report is about. It's about giving you, first of all, kind of an overarching, what does alignment look like right now? Are you in alignment? Are you prepared to hit your mission the way that you're expecting to? Do you have the right resources? Is your organization behaving in the right way? And then to start to identify, if you wanted to get a little bit more in alignment, these are the things that you're going to probably want to focus on first. Why go into that exercise blindly when you can get some data to at least get you off on the right foot, and to give you some really powerful things to start hanging your hat on. That's what this readiness report is all about. We want to make that more available to all of you in the near future. If you're interested in learning more about that, certainly reach out to any one of us, and you should also look for stuff to come your way in the near future around the product or the solution or the offering in general. I think that brings us to kind of a conclusion here. I don't know, Art or Tom, whether either of you have kind of some parting words before we maybe open the floor up to some of the questions and answers that have been submitted. But I'll give you that opportunity to say something.
Sure.
If you'd like.
I would just say, Charlie, that culture is key. It's hard to get our work done and achieve our missions anyway. Most of us have chosen to do things that are near impossible to achieve. I mean, let's face it. The reason that charities are in business is that the marketplace has decided that a lot of the things we're trying to do, you can't make money off of. So they're not trying to do it. So they've left it to the charitable sector to do a lot of this. But they've also left it to people who come to work every day and want to get something done. And as leaders of these people, I think it's really critical that we understand them and that we position them for success. We can't really do that unless we know how they see the organization and its challenges and opportunities. So I'm really thrilled that, you know, that there are ways for organizations to figure this out. And there's one tool here, but if this isn't what you want, there are hopefully some other ways you can go about that. But it's really critical, I think, that organizations take the time and energy to understand their employees and how they see their prospects. So that will be sort of my concluding remark before we get into the Q&A.
Thanks for that, Art. Tom? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think you guys really have already said it, but I'm going to go back to something that Art said about leaders being courageous. I'm not sure that, you know, let's face it, I think he's absolutely right. Too many of these surveys in the past, you sometimes fear them because it does boil down to, you know, what do my employees think of me, or this particular supervisor, or do they like the Friday afternoon get off work early type of programs. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what we found by taking this, and I alluded to it, is we actually got an education. And I would encourage anybody else looking at this to take that same journey to really define for yourself what is morale, what is culture, and understanding that the right culture drives the right morale. There's nothing wrong. You want strong morale. You want to attract and retain, recruit the best employees possible. But just giving them Friday afternoons off in and of by itself isn't going to do it. You have to have the right culture, the kind of employees that believe in your values, that are aligned with your values. And one last thing I'll share, this was something that came from our workforce. They really expressed to us when we had kind of breakdowns and went through webinars around the country with our staff to explain it, how much they appreciated the fact that we were actually measuring these aspects. It showed them that we cared about them, invested in their future, and that really meant something to them. And they got that whole understanding of the right culture is important. I want to be here, and it drives the right morale. People will be happy, will recommend us, will want to work here, understand why they work here, when we take the time to make sure that we understand what culture is and how important it is to us for our mission.
Yeah.
Well, very well said. Yeah. Art, did you want to add something?
Well, just that, you know, and to just bring back the simple point that those accredited charities perform so much better in many ways, at least in terms of net promoter score, than the groups that were part of the benchmark. And that needs to be remembered also. I think many of you have already done a lot of great work just by being accredited with us. I think now you get to understand more of the nuances of why as it relates to your employees. So that's another.
Yeah. I would love to just share one little additional data point that I forgot to mention earlier. It's one that I get a big kick out of. So again, we've gone through this process, or we've used the culture assessment with organizations across the globe, all sizes. You know, the largest organization we work with is 25,000 employees. The smallest is 25 employees, and all verticals. So from private, public, you name it, across the board. And the only on the employee net promoter score, you can either have a negative 100 all the way to a 100, and then any number in between. And obviously a 100 is the highest employee net promoter score you can get. That means that every single one of your employees is a promoter. They are out there going crazy for your brand and for your organization. The only time in all of the studies that we've done that we've gotten a 100 is from one of the organizations that participated in this study. Remarkable. We've never seen it anywhere else. And by the way, the only time that we've ever seen, or the lowest employee net promoter score that we ever saw, which is negative 64, came from our benchmark of not-for-profits that were not accredited. So I just think that just gives you a sense for the difference between these two groups and the extent to which they've really invested in culture. There is a continuum of culture. You can talk about it all day long, or you can get really serious and intentional about it. And you don't have to get from one end to the next overnight. All you got to do is take the first step. We hope that this conversation allowed you to do that a little bit, or at least helped you think about maybe taking that first step.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie and Art and Tom. We're going to go ahead and open it up for questions at this point. We had a couple in the queue. A couple of you asked questions in advance. Art, do you want to start to field some of those?
Sure. And it'd be helpful, Julie, if you can get my video up. Yeah, I think one of the important questions that I see here is what happens if management is not picking the right behaviors, so to speak. And what I'll say about that is, and Charlie, feel free to answer as well. What I'll say about that is management can be wrong about the behaviors that an organization should be undertaking in order to achieve their goals. But what you really want to find out, and I think what would really make me stand up if I were leading a particular organization, is how do the employees align with the sense that we have of the right behaviors. And that will tell me right away that maybe I'm not thinking correctly if all my employees are really in a different place. It might make me as a leader rethink what I believe are the right behaviors. So again, it's not so much that management will always be correct. Sometimes we need to look at how employees see the organization and ask ourselves, are we really thinking correctly about the behaviors that we need in order to drive our progress? Now, there's another reason why employees and leadership can be misaligned, right? That might be that we're not really clear about the strategy that we're trying to employ. So in some cases, management could be accurate. For instance, if you're, let's throw out an organization, if you're the American Red Cross and you're doing disaster relief, you probably want employees who are nimble, who can think on their feet, who are collaborative, who are innovative, who are thoughtful, because in the midst of a disaster, people have to be, have to operate that way as compared to people who need lots of direction all the time, right? So if you saw in your survey that your employees felt that management wasn't giving them lots of direction, you might say that, wow, we need to do more to help our employees become more independent thinkers and to operate more independently of leadership so that they could be more successful achieving our strategy. So a lot depends on what you're trying to achieve as an organization as relates to that particular question. And Charlie, I'm going to ask you this one. Someone asked, does it really matter depending on the size of an organization? Does size kind of skew what might be some of these answers and the alignment that you might get between leadership and employees?
Yeah, so I think the quick answer is that there are lots of variables that could impact how one is experiencing culture. What we don't really, where we stop short is saying things like, you know, that a big organization needs to operate this way and a small organization needs to operate this way. It is not unusual to see some really strong similarities, particularly when you're looking at, for instance, this particular study and the group that we included in it, between how culture is experienced across sizes of organizations. Said differently, we didn't see significant differences in how a large charitable organization responded to or experiences culture versus a smaller charitable organization. We're still talking about behaviors. We're still talking about how certain experiences are show up in the workplace, and that has less to do with size and really more to do with how your culture is in fact designed, which is really kind of what we were focused on.
Tom, someone asked, what if we don't have employees? And I know you thought this might be a useful exercise for organizations to take with their boards and volunteers.
Well, I think, yeah, that's obviously one of the first questions I asked all of you was that we found such value, as I've already said, for our staff. But again, we have a board of directors that is focused on culture as well. And we realize that the two have to work hand in hand for a nonprofit, that we have to have a workforce that is building a strong culture, strong values, strong culture, but we need to have our volunteer leadership aligned with us. So if you don't have volunteers, I mean, consider it. Maybe not all the questions will apply, but many of them will. It might be a useful exercise to take through with your volunteer leadership to see if, in fact, the culture that they have as a shared experience really aligns with your strategic intent, your values, and what you really want to see as far as the foundation you're building for the future.
Sure, and I'd love to get some feedback from some of the participants today, just to see if you're actually finding that culture is something for you to really be concerned about. Have you seen situations where your misalignment might have slowed your progress in it? Just go ahead and type the response. We'd love to see that as feedback, because we just have a sense that in this day and age, if you don't really have tabs on your culture, it's going to be very difficult to achieve what you're setting out to do. It's hard to do it anyway, as I mentioned, because of what we're all trying to do. But if your culture isn't in alignment, then you really have some challenges. So if you don't mind, go ahead and send us some feedback on that. Charlie, one additional question for you. When you think about many organizations that have gone through this process, what do you see as probably the 1, 2, or 3 major takeaways for them that you've probably gotten from many organizations that have gone through this? After they go through it, what are they generally saying?
Yeah. Well, I think that this exercise, more than anything, can be the first step, if not maybe the most important first step, or most important step in maturing along that continuum from an organization that talks about culture and unfortunately doesn't do much more than just pay it some lip service, to actually doing something about it that's more intentional, that's more meaningful, that's more actionable. If there were one thing, I mean, aside from pages and pages of data and lots of findings and interesting and colorful charts and all of those things, the one thing that is simply the most powerful for every organization that we've worked with is awareness. Like, I now have a stronger awareness. Some of these things were gut to me. I mean, you know, we're close to the business. We're intuitive. We experience this stuff every day. But to be able to articulate it in a much more empirical way, and in a way that gives us context and color that can fuel a bigger conversation, like, that's really powerful. It's not about an answer. It's not about a 3-ring binder of all of the recommendations of the things that your organization has to do to become more successful. It's a discovery process. And this is a really important step in that process.
So Becky says that once we identified our culture, one of the important things was to incorporate culture questions into the hiring process. Now, that would seem to me to be a very useful way to use this information. You know, once you know your culture, you want to make sure you're bringing people into the organization that can actually fit that. Or if your culture is misaligned, I would imagine you want to make sure you're bringing people in who might align with what you're trying to achieve. Also, I guess there are what do organizations generally try to do, Charlie, once they find that there is misalignment?
Yeah, well, so and Becky, I love that. You know, we encourage organizations and we work with them to do the same. To okay, now that we've got kind of a baseline understanding, now that we've done this culture assessment. And by the way, we recommend that you don't do that culture assessment really any more than once a year. It's a lot of data, but once you have it, now you can start to focus on some things. And yes, many of those organizations will now incorporate those things into various aspects of the employment life cycle or the journey. So from the recruiting cycle to onboarding to all the way through exit. And they're trying to understand how are those things being experienced or not throughout. So awesome that you guys are already thinking about that. So that is one of the things, Art, that organizations will do, is that they will kind of get a lot more committed to gathering data and data points at various aspects of that experience. So now it's not just once a year, but we're looking at things throughout. We have organizations, and we've got some methodologies and some recommendations on how to start all this stuff. We have organizations that create internal culture teams, and they're comprised of 5 or 6 people from across the organization, and their responsibility, their primary focus, or one of their primary focuses, is to really be the stewards to the culture. Okay, we understand what we have to accomplish. We understand what behaviors are going to help us get there, and which ones may be out of alignment. How are we going to get into alignment? That's a much more kind of hands-on, like planning, project planning and deliverable, and holding each other accountable to it, and really heightening visibility across the organization. There is no one owner of culture in your business. The best way to get it done is to have everybody own it. And so a lot of what we see organizations do to get serious is they really create some visible stewardship around that.
Yeah. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time. And I wanted to thank both of you for joining this, and Charlie, you especially for putting the survey tool together for us and for others in the sector. Obviously, if anyone's interested in this tool, this particular tool, please reach out to us. We'll certainly reach out to you. Just as a follow-up, there'll be a survey that we ask you about this particular session. And just so you know, there will be many more of these sessions that we'll be doing to try to give you some insight into how you can improve your organization. We've decided at WGA that we should be about helping organizations get better, not simply evaluating you against our standards, which is a great thing to know, but to also provide you with tools and experiences that actually improve your work. So we think this is one key element of that, and there'll be many more in the months and weeks ahead. So I want to just thank everybody for joining, and we'll see you at another session.